Ladies and gentlemen, how extremely nice to see you all here, and it really is as an accolade for Professor Carpenter that so many people have wanted to come to listen to him speak this evening about the Charter in 1225. If we've all more or less found a place to be, I think on balance I will just let David fire away, and he is very pleased at the end of the talk to take some Q&A, so we'll have a chance to ask questions as well. David, can I leave you to it? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me here this evening. And it's a historic occasion in a way, because today, the 11th of February 2025, is the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. The anniversary of this charter you see on the screen here, which was issued by King Henry III at Westminster on the 11th day of February in the 9th year of his reign, so the 11th of February 1225. There are 4 originals of the 1225 charter still surviving. This one is in the archives of Durham Cathedral, and I'm afraid in the 18th century the archivist spilt a pot of ink all over it, so that's why it's slightly damaged. Now, the statement that this is Magna Carta might occasion some surprise, for surely the 800th anniversary of the Charter was marked in 2015, 10 years ago, when the great and good of the land, under the late Queen, Duke of Edinburgh, the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, what a long time ago that seems, they all gathered at Runnymede to celebrate the charter conceded there by King John on the 15th of June 1215. And if we go on, here is King John's charter in a wonderful 1731 engraving of it by John Pine, and to make it a bit more marketable, he jazzed it up by including the coats of arms, or the purported coats of arms, of all the Magna Carta barons. It's a dangerous thing to be a Magna Carta, because I'm now showing you this, because alas, in the British Library now, it's almost entirely defaced, so it's better seen in this 1731 wonderful engraving. Now, the statement that this isn't Magna Carta, whereas this is, I think it might almost give rise to some consternation here at the Temple Church, because the Temple Church's claim to be integral to the history of Magna Carta is, of course, bound up with the Charter of 1215, the Charter of King John. And as you all know, it was here in the early part of 1215 that the barons gathered and issued their first demands, which led a few months later to John's Charter. So I'm afraid I'm probably not very popular here in now, Robin, destroying your connection with Magna Carta altogether. So the question obviously to ask is, what on earth is this all about? And it's really about this, that this charter in the medieval period was very rarely called Magna Carta. John's Charter was very rarely called Magna Carta. Instead, what was it called? It was called the Charter of Runnymede, the Charter of Runnymede. Magna Carta was almost sorry, I thought I'd just show you first of all my first meeting of King John, seeing what the text. This is my children's history, the island story. They don't make books like that anymore. Our island story, and it's King John at Runnymede. And the text had no doubt that he was sealing Magna Carta. There is Runnymede. So if we come on, this is what people thought of in the medieval period as Magna Carta. This, as I say, was the Charter of Runnymede. People were well aware that the 1225 Magna Carta was based on the Charter of 1215, but that didn't stop them calling the Charter of 1215 the Charter of Runnymede, and this one, Magna Carta. So what I want to do today is really explore briefly 3 questions. The first is, how do we get from the Charter of Runnymede in 1215, this charter, to Magna Carta in 1225. The second question is whether the 1225 charter was, in terms of its essence, a better charter, more likely to survive than its predecessors. And I think I'm going to suggest that it certainly was, it was qualitatively a far superior charter than that of 1215, or, as we'll see, the successors in between. And then the third question I'll ask is how and when did the Charter of 1215 suddenly come up and overtake the Charter of 1225 and become regarded as the Magna Carta? So can I start with the first question? How do we get from 1215 to 1225? And you may be thinking of your sort of how complex some of this is, though not, I'm sure, in this learned audience. There is actually a leaflet, I think, Robin, within your service papers, which does summarize some of this progress. So we need to go back now to 1215 and to think, why did King John issue this charter? There is King John on his wonderful tomb in Worcester Cathedral. And the reason, I think what we need to appreciate is that by the end of 1215, the future for this document here, John's charter, seemed very problematic. It seems as though it had been a failure without a future. Now, that was for two reasons. First of all, why had John conceded the charter in the first place? It was what you hoped was that everyone would think, oh, this benevolent king, he's granted this charter, we'll all lay down our arms and there'll be peace. What John didn't think, what he calculated, was that the barons would never get their act together to actually enforce its poisonous terms. Now, as soon as he realized that he was completely wrong about that, he changed tack and he got the Pope to quash the charter. So within a couple of months, John has abandoned the charter and it's been quashed by the Pope. But equally, the barons, although they felt very attached to the charter, they'd abandoned it either, because they thought, well, there's no way we can hold the slippery King John to its terms. We need to go down a different route altogether. And what is that different route? They deposed John and they offered the throne to the eldest son of the King of France, Louis. And Louis came to England in May 1216. He carried all before him. He was welcomed into London. Great majority of the barons supported him. Here's a wonderful charter of Louis issued during the siege of Hertford Castle in November 1216. And if you look at the witnesses, a lot of the very greatest barons of England are there beside him, supporting him. Now, Louis had no brief for the charter. His view was that I'm a benevolent Capetian king, you don't need a charter with me around. Probably if he'd actually won the war, he would have issued some very, very brief coronation charter and left it at that. So as you see, the charter seems to have been abandoned. John had had it rejected by the Pope. Louis was ignoring it. What saved the charter was King John's death in that great storm howling round Newark Castle in October 1216. And he leaves a 9-year-old boy here, looking very anxious, doesn't he? Drawn by Matthew Paris. Well might he be anxious, because no King of England succeeded in a more desperate situation than Henry III. So what happens then? The minority government of Henry III make a crucial calculation which shaped the whole future shape of English history. And their calculation was the only way to survive is for the government to change tack completely, for Henry, in the name of the government, to accept what John had rejected and Louis was ignoring. And what they did was to issue this document, which is a new version of Magna Carta. It was issued in November 1216, just after Henry III's coronation. Now, I think two people should be celebrated for this. Two people were crucial to this decision, and it was they who sealed it. On the left, and the seals are missing, it was sealed by the papal legate Guala, and on the right, it was sealed by someone whose effigy is down there in the nave of this wonderful church, William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke. And it was those two people together who took this crucial decision to actually accept, as I've said, what John had condemned, what had rejected, what Louis was ignoring, and issue this new version of Magna Carta. Now, I think for William Marshall, aged, doyen of chivalry, around 70, that was quite an easy decision. He'd remained loyal to John for a variety of material and moral reasons. But he knew that he or his descendants are going to benefit from the baronial chapters in the Charter just as much as anyone else. I ought to explain, the Charter abandoned some of the more pernicious, from the King's point of view, regulations in the 1215 Charter, but fundamentally it was the same, and for most of the main baronial clauses are all still there. I think it was more remarkable what the Guala, the papal legate, did, because the Pope, of course, had condemned the Charter, and Guala had absolutely no means of consulting the Pope on this total change of course. And I think it shows Guala's wisdom and far-sightedness that he realised he had to go it alone. He had to take this crucial step. I'd love to have seen the letter in which he sent to Pope Honorius to explain himself, but that, alas, that doesn't exist. So the government has now accepted Magna Carta, and I think it had a crucial effect in actually then winning the war. There were very few actual immediate desertions from Louis's side to the side of the young king. But when we come to the absolutely crucial Battle of Lincoln in May 1217, one of the most decisive battles in the whole history of England and by extension Europe, when the regent, William Marshall, managed to shatter the the French forces and the rebel barons who combined together. What's absolutely clear is that the rebel barons at Lincoln did not fight very hard. Not one of them was killed. Huge numbers of them were just simply captured and went into captivity. They seem to have struck token blows and then surrendered. Why did they surrender? One thing, of course, was that evil King John had been replaced by an innocent young boy. But I think even more important, Magna Carta had been conceded. Oh, I shouldn't say Magna Carta. A version of the 1215 Charter had been conceded. Their cause was won. And that was confirmed at the end of the war. Sorry, this is Matthew Paris's dramatic drawing of the Battle of Lincoln. That their cause was won was confirmed at the end of the war, when another new version of the Charter was issued. There it is, and this one has actually got the seal, alas, defaced, of the papal legate on the left, and William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, on the right. You can see he was an old boy, because no upstanding baron would have had such a small seal as that. But William Marshall always had contempt for people who had these big showy seals, and thought, well, in my day you just had a little seal, and so that's all he's got there. So a new version of the Charter is issued as a sort of part of the peace settlement at the end of the war, when Louis resigns his claim to the throne, goes back to France. And now, alongside it, there is a separate charter issued here dealing with the royal forest. And it's only now that the term Magna Carta is introduced. And it arises from the need to distinguish the two charters. We've now got the original charter in a new version, and we've got the Charter of the Forest. And as the original charter is physically larger than the Forest Charter, the clerk drafting a proclamation decided to call it Magna Carta, the Great Charter. So in origin, the term referred not to the charter's grandeur, but its physical size, as against its smaller forest brother. And here is the very, very first written text of Magna Carta, the first reference to its name. And you can see it's wonderful. It's actually an afterthought. The clerk scratches his head. Think, how am I going to describe the original charter? Well, it's bigger than the Forest Charter. And so he puts a little arrow, and above the line, you see Magna Carta. He had little knowledge, did he, when he wrote that it was going to go round the world. So we've now got to 1217. How do we get on to 1225, the final definitive Magna Carta. And that's easy to explain in a way because it arose from a crisis in the dynasty's continental possessions. In 1224, Louis, now King of France, Louis VIII, had conquered Poitou, and he was now threatening Gascony. And that was the dynasty's one remaining continental possession. Now, if the dynasty was going to save Gascony, it needed above all money in huge amounts to hire soldiers, buy support. And the government knew in 1225 the only way to get that money was to levy a great tax on the kingdom, and they also knew they could never get that tax without the kingdom's consent, without the consent of an assembly which was soon to be called Parliament. And so what they concocted was a deal in which, in return for the tax, a new version of the Charter, now called Magna Carta, would be conceded. And here we come back to that. Now, I don't know why it doesn't click on. Maybe I can... right. Anyway, never mind. So the... I didn't quite know. All right, okay. Well, I will continue nonetheless. So the two people, I think, who really crafted the crucial deal in which this new version of the Charter is conceded in return for the tax. Well, first of all, the Justiciar of England, who was in charge of the government, Hubert de Burgh. But much more important, I think, was Archbishop Stephen Langton. Now, Langton had an ideological attachment to the Charter, and he was absolutely determined to put it onto a new footing. And that's where we come to the second thing I wanted to look at, how the 1225 Charter is qualitatively different. Oh, right, sorry. Is how the 1225 Charter we see here is qualitatively different and on a different level from all its predecessors. Now, what is Langton trying to do? He's got a real problem which he wants to solve. And that problem is encapsulated in a great council meeting in 1223 when one of the most rebarbative old ministers of King John, William Brewer, came out with it, and he said, these charters, talking about the 1216 and 1217 charters, are not valid. They're not valid because fundamentally they've been extracted from the king by force of war. And of course that was true of the 1216 charter. It had been extracted, conceded in the middle of war. Really, it was true of the 1217 charter, which was sort of part of the peace treaty. It was certainly true of the charter of 1215. So there's this real doubt hanging over the validity of the charters. And that's what Langton, absolutely committed to the charters, wants to solve. He wants to put the charters on a new level. And the way of doing that, of course, is to show they are consensual, they are part of a freely engaged bargain between the king and the kingdom. And that's what he does in this new charter. So if we have a look at it, the first point, which actually I think came out from what Robin was reading, at the start it says the king has conceded this charter of his own free will. Now that, curiously enough, had never been said in any of the previous versions, 1215, 1216, 1217, hadn't said that it had been of the king's free will. And secondly, of course, the proof of that is that it is now sealed by the king. And this Durham version has got, this Durham original, got wonderful, wonderful seal of the king. And remember the 1216, 1217 ones, because Henry had no seal then, had to be sealed by the regent and the legate. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think even more fundamental, and I think it was a stroke of genius on Langton's part to put this into the charter, is that at the end of the charter, what does it say? The king is made to say that in return for all the concessions I'm making to the kingdom, everyone in the kingdom has granted me a tax. So it's absolutely there in black and white that this is a freely entered bargain between the king and the kingdom. It's actually recorded. No one can possibly say anymore that Magna Carta is the product of force. And the extent to which it is now an accepted thing by the greater and good of the land is seen in the, I'm always doing something wrong here, I can't sort of click this on.
Next one on, is it?
Yeah.
Go down and do it manually.
What we're going to see now is that we go on for a bit, actually, that's Langton on his seal. And then the next one is, yes, keep going and you'll see, so this is a wonderful, wonderful document here. This is the copy of the 1225 Charter made at Cairn, the Abbey of Cairn in Dorset, very soon afterwards. And what's so amazing about it is that the witness list of the 1225 Charter is set out in these big, big letters. And it's as though the clerk appreciated that for the first time, 1215 Charter, 1216, 1217 Charter have no great witness list. This is the first witness list of Magna Carta, and it shows all the most important people, whatever stance they'd taken in the Civil War, are coming together in support of the Charter. And the first line, you have all the bishops, starting with S. Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. Next line, you have this huge list of all the major abbots. Then you have the earls headed by Hubert de Burgh. Then you have all the barons. And then look at how proud, how it sort of resonates, doesn't it? The clerk thought, this is so important. So he puts in capital letters, Data apud Westmonasterium undecimo die Februari anno regni nostro nono. So absolutely clear, 11th of February, 9th year of the King, 1225, at Westminster. So I think that absolutely summed up that, this is now an absolutely consensual document. And that made it possible for Langton to do one more thing in support of the Charter, which had never been done before. And that is, he promulgated all the other bishops sentences of excommunication against everyone who sought to break the Charter. Now, no sentences of excommunication supported the 1215 Charter, 1216 or 1217. Now, at last, in 1225, the Church comes full square behind the Charter, and that was an important reason why it survives. Why wasn't it there 1215, 1216, 1217? Precisely because these still seem to be the product of war. They were not consensual documents, whereas now it's a consensual document. It's perfectly possible for the Church to support it. And there was one last thing I think Langton did for the 1225 Charter. He made it far more inclusive. Now, the 1215, 1216, 1217 Charters, the liberties in them had only been granted to the free. Now, in this august assembly, of course, I'm sure all you would have been free. You would have been earls and barons and so on, and countesses and baronesses and so on. But of course, if we could make you, instead of an elite group here in the Temple Church, a representative of the ordinary run of the population, at least half of you would not have been free, and you would not therefore have been entitled in the liberties in the Charter. You'd all have been unfree peasants. Well, now in 1225 that was altered, and a new preamble began the Charter saying the liberties had been granted to everybody. Now, we may well say that that was largely cosmetic. The Charter remained, in many of its chapters, a deeply baronial document. But that's not true of all of it, and that was true from the start. I mean, the first chapter was on the Church, very important chapter on London, and Magna Carta was treasured by London, important chapters in favour of knights and free tenants, and the local government chapters in the Charter, and a new one was added in 1217, I think could benefit all sections of society. So I think underlying that's another reason why the Charter survived and the 1225 version becomes definitive. It's the broad range of people who benefit from it. I think you can argue, and we can't do that here, that it did constitute a real watershed between lawless and lawful rule. Now, that brings me, in conclusion, to my third and final question, which is how did the 1215 Charter, the Charter of King John, come up on the rails, as it were, and overtake the 1225 Charter, win the race, and become the Magna Carta? So how does this happen? Now, it took a very long time for that to happen. Subsequent kings in the medieval period, they never issued a new version of Magna Carta. They simply confirmed the Charter of 1225. If we go on to the next thing. So this is, go back one. So this is a confirmation of Magna Carta by Edward I. Sorry. I don't want to see Blackstone just yet. So this is Edward I confirming, and this is actually 1300, Robin, just after, 3 years later than 1297, and there's Edward I there. You can see Magna Carta in the corner, but what he's doing is confirming the charter of his father. There's Henricus Dei Gratia. So that was true of subsequent kings throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. It was even true if we come on to the 17th century, when, as you probably know, distinguished lawyers here, Sir Edward Coke in particular, revived the charter as a barrier against Stuart tyranny. Now, what was the charter he revived? It was the Charter of Henry III. And if we go on, we'll see one of Coke's books. And there you are, Magna Carta, made in the 9th year of King Henry III and confirmed by Edward I in the 28th year of his reign, that's 1300. Observations from the Lord Chief Justice Cox, comments upon it, translation, everything. This is a later edition, 1680. But, no reference to King John here at all. Nothing about King John's charter. Magna Carta is Henry III's charter. And of course that was also, of course, Shakespeare. Shakespeare's King John has nothing at all about the charter in it. So how does all this change? Well, it all changes with this great 18th century lawyer who now we can see, William Blackstone, a good, solid man, a rather difficult personality in some ways, but anyway, a great lawyer, but also a great academic lawyer in writing about the law. And what Blackstone did in 1759 was to, for the first time, sort out and print all the different versions of Magna Carta, or what he called Magna Carta. So he published the full text of 1215, the full text of 1216, the full text of 1217, the full text of 1225 with the allied forest charters. And that had never been done before. There'd always been huge confusion between these various texts. Now, in this 1759 book, Blackstone simply called the 1215 Charter of King John, he called it Magna Carta, made no bones about it. If we go on, we'll see that. So there, Magna Carta, Regis Johannis, 15th day of June, 1215. So Magna Carta is King John. If you read the introduction, he doesn't give any explanation for this, but I think it's just implicit, because setting out all the texts, 1215, 1216, 1217, 1225, it's very evident that all of them essentially derive from the 1215 Charter. And so I don't think Blackstone has no problem about calling it Magna Carta, although it's the first time it ever had been called that. Now, Blackstone was so decisive, so clear, so authoritative, that stuck. In other words, John's Charter becomes Magna Carta, save with one curious exception, which again is significant here, which is that on the statute book of the United Kingdom, the charter there is still the Charter of 1225. So if we go on and we look at some triumph of Magna Carta in 2015 itself, when the government, as perhaps you remember, were trying to introduce court fees to bring civil litigation, and the Lord Chief Justice appealed to Magna Carta. Court fees are against Magna Carta, he said. And look at the power of the Charter. Very soon ministers prepare to retreat on court's charge. But the chapter of Magna Carta he was appealing to was chapter 29 of the 1225 Charter, not chapter 39 of the Charter of 1215. So on the statute book of the United Kingdom, it's still 1225. But everywhere else, since Blackstone, the Magna Carta has been essentially the Charter of King John. If we go on, you'll see, for example, votes for women, and clearly Magna Carta, and clearly that is King John, not a young Henry III, who is, so in popular culture, you can see Magna Carta is King John. And equally, of course, it's true academically, if you go on, because here are my very battered copies of the great work on Magna Carta of the last century by J.C. Holt, Sir James Holt. And the second one you can see, Magna Carta. What is the seal there? It's the seal of King John. Fundamentally, the book is about this first and second edition. I never encourage people to look at the third edition because it's got a preface saying everything I've said about Magna Carta is wrong. No, that's not quite a bit of an exaggeration. But anyway, as you can see, I mean, both the books essentially are about King John's Charter. There's just a final chapter called The Reissues and the Myth, in which 1216, 17, 1225 are sketched. So, in popular culture, in academic writing, Magna Carta has become the 1215 Charter. It's one. And so, in conclusion, what would I say? It seems to me fitting that here at the centre of the legal profession, a great lawyer, William Blackstone, whose chambers were indeed in Pump Court, should make the Charter of John the Magna Carta, and thus restore the temple itself to a central place in Magna Carta's story. Thank you very much. Thank you for rescuing me.
David, thank you so much, and thank you very much in your last 30 seconds for redeeming everything, really. I think we'll buy into Blackstone. We'll bank that. Well, we will bank Blackstone, I think. Thank you very, very much indeed. That was about as illuminating and informative and wise as one could possibly have hoped for. Absolutely eye-opening and mind-expanding. We're hugely grateful to you. Now, Professor Carpenter has said that he's happy to take some questions. I think actually Mark might just see, oops, oh, hang on, there's a raving mic somewhere. But it is true that we're quite busy. We may have to ask at least the first person asking a question just to sort of bellow. Do you mind, David, you excuse me?
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. Could you tell us a little bit about the Charter of the Forest? What were the key elements of that?
Yeah. Well, the Charter of the Forest had two key elements. It's often thought of as an ecological document, and I'm afraid this is a mistake. The main aim of the Charter was to allow great men to exploit their woodland more effectively. Because the problem with the Royal Forest, or forest law it's better to think of, forest law embraced the woods of many lords, religious institutions and so on. And if you had your own woods within the bounds of the Royal Forest, within the subject of forest law, there were huge restrictions on your ability to exploit them, cut down trees, create new arable land. If you wanted to do that, you would have to pay very large sums of money. So what the key thing about the Charter of the Forest was to reduce the area of the Royal Forest, to reduce the area subject to forest law, so lots of great men no longer found their own woodland within the Royal Forest, and so they no longer had to pay large sums of money to exploit it. So it was the reverse of protecting woodland. It was actually making woodland, you can make it easy to exploit it. But there was one qualifications act, for which I think, I've said most of you, if we could you would be peasants. If we could go back into the 13th century, one very important chapter said that no one any longer was to lose life and limb for basically killing the protected beasts of the royal forest, for poaching, in other words. And as most poachers were lower class, and mostly peasants, that was something which is really going to protect the ordinary people of the land. So the Forest Charter is, I mean, a bit like Magna Carta itself. It gives a lot to very important people, but gives something to you and me.
I'm not sure that I need it. My family say I have a penetrating voice. What are the main points in the 1225 that are not found in 1215?
Yeah, well, I did have something on that, but I left it out. Actually, a very standard undergraduate essay is the 1225 stronger, weaker in terms of its restrictions on kingship than 1215. In some ways, it's weaker because the main thing left out from 1216 onwards was what's called the security clause, in which 25 barons were empowered to force the king to keep the charter by seizing his property, seizing his castle. That was left out, and it left the charter with no constitutional means of enforcement. On the other hand, 1225 was stronger than 1215, firstly because, of course, it's now accompanied by the Forest Charter, and secondly, there's also a big new chapter which was introduced in 1217, regulating the running of local government, the running of the courts of county and hundred in particular, and that was very, very valued by wide sections of society, knights, free men, peasants. So in that sense, the Charter of 1225 is stronger than 1215. So it's a bit of swings and roundabouts. I mean, the whole question of it is something, sort of much wider question of how far the Charter was obeyed in the 13th century. And, you know, that's again on the one hand, on the other. But I think it did make a profound difference myself to the operations of kingship. Perhaps it's too much to say it was a watershed between lawless and lawful rule, but, you know, it's somewhere around that. But not everyone would agree with that.
And I probably won't need it. You mentioned that Stephen Langton was exercised quite a degree of foresight and forethought in those various clauses, particularly in the 1225 version. But I think the clauses which we hold most dear now, which are those relating to no free man shall be taken, and in terms of justice being free and available to all with no charge, they are buried within, I think, the 1215 Charter as well as the 1225, almost insignificant. Why is that, and is there the hand of Stephen Langton in that to slip them in so that maybe John...
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right, and you've raised a curious thing, that those two most famous chapters, no free man is to be outlawed, deprived of property, save by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of land. To no one will we deny, delay, right and justice. That was what the Lord Chief Justice was appealing to in 2015. They actually are 39 and 40 in the 1215 Charter, and they're 29 combined in the Charter of 1225. So the question is, why were they so far down, which I think is what you were asking, buried within the Charter, why they don't come much closer to the start, as they had come actually in a separate concession John had made in May 1215. I haven't really got an answer to that, and I don't think anyone has got an answer to that. It must have been somehow in the drafting of it. It's also quite way down in the Articles of the Barons. I still think they were thought of from the word go as very important, and actually Langton would have thought they were very important because they also appear in his justice is not to be sold. That's also an ecclesiastical principle, and that principle occurs in his own diocesan legislation as well. So I think Langton would have thought those chapters were very important.
Hello. Edward I, I think, put it on the statute book in 1297. Which version?
Yeah, it was, well, 1297 was just a confirmation of the 1225 Charter. I think actually, so all Edward I did in 1297 to say, I have inspected the charter of my father. The whole text of the charter of his father is set out with that wonderful witness list. And then he says, I confirm it. And actually, the far better than 1297 was 1300, because 1297 was only issued was only witnessed by Edward I's son, the future hopeless and hapless Edward II, whereas the 1300 confirmation was a proper charter of Edward I. But I agree that 1297 and 1300 are both on the statute book as well.
Thank you.
Sorry, do you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask. I was just going to ask, you know, since then, why it's sort of never been challenged or added to, or, and if, you know, if it's critiqued in any way, what would be improvements?
So why? Sorry, I don't quite understand what.
Yeah. I mean, since then, have there not been any significant challenges or desire to improve them?
I mean, I think the reason why it stuck, the 1225 Charter, and it was just confirmed by subsequent kings, was really because of the authority I suggested, that it was clearly the product of, in a way, clearly of Parliament, with huge witness lists and everything like that, the sense of excommunication, and the way it's now inclusive. I think that gave it a status which helped it, and the subsequent king didn't need to issue new versions. But it is a triumph. It is a really interesting indication of the status of the 1225 Charter that the later kings confirm it, rather than, as they could easily have done, issuing a new charter. I mean, you mentioned the no free man is to be outlawed, imprisoned. That was glossed in the reign of Edward III to mean no one of any estate. In other words, it became also more inclusive. So that was a sort of change, a redraft, but it was not in the charter itself. It was a sort of commentary. It was a statute outside the charter, which meant that everyone could benefit from that chapter. It's not just free men. I think free men, incidentally, meant women too. The homo is there used, as it is in the Bible, and it's widely understood in the medieval period to mean people, not just men.
How much of your scholarship has been progressed by digitisation and being able to read the marginalia of the various charter?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. In 2015, we did have the Magna Carta project, which is all online, and I wouldn't say, I think actually I've since then been collecting all the unofficial copies made of Magna Carta. And of course, it is a huge thing now that you can just go with your mobile phone and actually photograph all these copies. I mean, the one going back to which Edward I, that's just my copy of an unofficial thing. So, I think the scholarship has been hugely helped by mobile phone cameras, which enables you to go into libraries and simply photograph documents. And I mean, I think that the electronic versions of Magna Carta, obviously it helps you search for things within them too, which you couldn't possibly have done before. So I think scholarship has been greatly helped in those ways. I ought to have mentioned, of course, the wonderful Magna Carta exhibition here, which I felt fortunate retrieved at the end by saying, you know, this is Magna Carta after all. So it's not there in vain, but everyone ought to look at that. It's a wonderful exhibition.
I
we owe David a huge debt of thanks. I think we also actually owe you a drink after your labours. You can tell that everyone has been hanging on your every word. So before we give David a proper acknowledgement, may I just say that there are more refreshments for anyone who can stay, and we are extremely grateful to Mrs. Paul and Graham Beck for having provided some rather special and South African fizzy wine, which will give the evening a suitable celebratory conclusion. So anyone who can stay, please do. David, I'm so sorry, I'm a clerk. I have to try and sell something, don't I, in an evening?
No, do.
There are assorted, Matt at the door has assorted booklets about Magna Carta. I promise you I did not write them, so I can praise them with honesty and some sort of integrity, and you're most welcome to buy copies. But really, the main task remains is simply on behalf of all of us here and everyone who is watching at home and will do so over the next 48 hours to give enormous thanks to Professor Carpenter for a most wonderful hour. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.